The next story I'm particularly interested in hearing because, as you know, this gentleman is responsible for my own return to the Old Mass, so I'd like to see how things worked out a few years before. Doctor?
Well, as a professor of literature, I'll tell a story. Although it can't be a bedtime story because there's a good lecture yet to come, so
Don't sleep through it.
I came to the Catholic Church at the age of 31, some years ago. I was raised liberal Protestant, and that adjective is extremely important because there are Protestants who know their Bible, who know something of Christian doctrine, and they're the fundamentalist, hardcore conservative ones. I was raised liberal Protestant, which means I had an upbringing in terms of church going, of church suppers and bake sales. Some lovely people, and I was lucky to be raised in a very good home of good parents. But in terms of the religious training, there basically wasn't any. I memorized a few scripture verses. Occasionally, I would go and sit through those Sunday morning worship ceremonies in the bare church, and not pay attention to the sermon and sing a few hymns and then go home. That was about it. What that means is that when I was 17 and was free and went off to the university, I just gave the whole thing up. And I say in sorrow, this is what I now see my Catholic students doing, by the way. Many of you who have known this misfortune of very often when you see the young people leave home, as soon as they get away, they stop. They just simply stop. I would just say to you, I know that. That's what I did. It is a mark of Protestantism because there's nothing there to hold on to, and they know it. And as a result, they leave. So I went into the university, a modern university, where they taught me the three things that I think you get at a modern university. Hate your family, hate your country, hate God, who doesn't exist anyway, but hate him anyway. And that's what my head was filled with, so that when I graduated and went on to graduate school, my head was filled with absolute nonsense. I still knew nothing about religion, although I would talk about it at length, mainly to try to debunk it, because there was no such thing. There was just nature, and nature was all we needed, and everything was material, and there was really only one commandment, and that was we should be nice to each other even though life has no meaning, which is a very peculiar thought if you go to the center of it. So I began teaching, and that's the sort of nonsense I was teaching. It was absolute nonsense because I knew nothing. And I had no business being in front of a class teaching anything because I didn't know anything, but I was one of those teachers. I was a modern teacher, head full of feathers and sawdust, and just spewing them out around the room. And then one day, I was teaching at Temple University in Philadelphia. I had a student in the back of the class who raised his hand and challenged me and began debating me in the classroom. And in no time at all, I was aware of the fact that most teachers live in terror of. I had a student in my class who knew 100 times what I knew. I was an absolute ignoramus, and this student was really smart. Now, the only thing I can say to my credit is at that point I began coming into class. I am not making this up. This is not an exaggeration. I would come into class with a notebook, stand at the podium, ask the young man a question, and take notes. I was being paid to teach, and I was standing at the podium taking notes from a student who knew something. Now, fortunately, I was lucky enough to get a quick education. The rest of the students really didn't care. Most of them slept through it. which is what they'd been doing during most of my lectures anyway, and appropriately so, since I wasn't saying anything. Well, the long and the short of it was, we debated, we talked for hours, for days, for weeks, and he won every debate, every single debate. I had, God be praised, I had a logical head so that I could follow an argument and know when I had lost one. And I lost every debate we had. And finally, if you pursue this, is there truth? How can we know it? If there is, what do we do about it? Where do we find it? You're going to end up at Christ. It's going to happen. And at that point, I really had one question. I can't say coming back, because I wasn't coming back to something. You can't come back to something you've never known. It had been vaguely there as a word, but I knew nothing about it. And suddenly I realized, this is not only important and serious, this is true. And now I have to do something. And so it was clear that I had to get involved with some church. There were two choices. The fundamentalist Protestants, because they do believe something. They do know their Bible. Or the Catholic Church. As a student of literature and a professor of literature, I knew something about the past, and I'll just make a quick comment here. I won't go into it at length, but it's a comment of the great writer Evelyn Waugh, who converted to Catholicism, who said of the Catholic Church that in considering it, any man has to know it is true because it presents a coherent philosophical system that makes intransigent historical claims. If you look at the philosophy of the Catholic Church, it is airtight. It is reasonable and complete. If you look at the history of the Church over 2,000 years, it has given us everything that is good. As a result, how could it not be true? And therefore, when the time came, I chose the Catholic Church. Now, this young man who had converted about 6 months before I did, he had not been a Catholic either. He was simply an honest mind seeking the truth. He had walked into a Catholic church and said to the priest, I want to become a Catholic, and then started battling with the priest who was supposed to give him instruction, because the priest was presenting a whole series of new ideas in a new way, and this brilliant young man was fighting them and saying, well, no, Father, the church teaches this. So you now had a convert instructing the priest in the faith. My friend did not want me to go through that experience. He went all around the Philadelphia area until he found an elderly Irish Monsignor out in one of the suburbs who had the faith. So once a week I would hop on a train, go out there, and get real instruction from a real priest who had the real Catholic faith, and it was a great blessing. And I also would go out to his Mass, which was the Novus Ordo Mass, which he said very reverently. So I wasn't quite sure at the beginning of what had happened until I was received into the church, and then didn't make the trip out there. I decided I'll go to Mass here right in Center City, Philadelphia, where I was living at the time, and suddenly I walked into something that looked just like the empty Protestant service I had left when I was 17. I'd been there. I'd seen it. I knew it. And I thought, what is this? This can't be what I've joined. This can't be what it's about. 2,000 years can't have come to this. I've already rejected this. And I tried to be good, and I tried to go, and I went for a while. And then I began doing the same thing again. I would sleep in Sunday mornings because there wasn't a reason to go. And then one summer, I was home visiting in Wisconsin, where I'm from originally. Got up one morning, my duty, I'll go to Mass, I'll see what I find here. I got in the car to drive to Church A. It was my intention to drive to Church A, St. Patrick's. I knew where it was. I backed out of the driveway, I headed for St. Patrick's, and I arrived at Church B, on the other side of town. It was one of those things, I was thinking about things, I was not paying attention. I wound up not just at the wrong church, but a church miles away from the one I had intended to go to. I was at Sacred Heart Parish. I didn't know how I got there. I looked, they had a Mass starting. I was just baffled. What am I doing here? But I thought, I don't have time to get over St. Patrick's. It started over there. There's a Mass here. I'll go to Mass here. I walked inside and heard In Troibe Altare Dei. And my goodness, there it was. I heard this strange language. There was the priest with his back to us. I had no idea what was happening. And I said to myself, this is that old Mass I've heard about. And about halfway through it, I said to myself, this is Catholic. And I was home at a place I had never known before. The old Mass for me at that moment was entirely new. It was not old. It was home. And at that instant I knew that's what it had been about. That's what it was supposed to be about. And that's how I would worship God in the future. One